All right, viewers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good evening, good day, and welcome to another interesting episode of Global Arena on my YouTube channel, Global Arena TV. I'm your host, Umar Isa Dandago. Well, today's interview is going to be very special because I have got an incredible guest from as far as Norway, there in the Scandinavia region of Northern Europe. And we are going to spend we're going to have two episodes with him. The first episode is going to focus on the Ukraine war and the China's role in mediating, in bringing an end to the war that has devastated not only Ukraine, but the whole world as well. The whole world, of course, has borne the brunt of the war economically and militarily and so on and so forth. Let's not forget the war, the information warfare, the fake news and so on and so forth that has been going around, especially on social media. So this is the first thing that we're going to focus on. And then on the second episode, we're going to focus on the very same Chinese role or China's roles in resolving the dispute, the long-standing dispute between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the two major Muslim majority nations that have been like diplomatically unfriendly with each other for years. So that would be later in the second episode. And so right now we're going to kick off with this Russia-Ukraine war thing and the roles of China resolving it. Professor, I am joined by Professor Glenn Diesen, Professor Glenn Diesen, at Southeastern University there in Norway. Thank you very much indeed, Professor, for joining us on Global Arena TV.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right. So as I've said, my name is Umar Isa Dandago. Professor, we're going to start with some basics here. Before I put this first question to you, I would like you to please introduce yourself to our viewers.
Well, my name is Glenn Diesen. I'm a professor at the University of Southeastern Norway. I actually did most of my background and studies were in Australia, where I was about 14 years. And then I lived a few years in Russia, where I worked as a professor at the Higher School of Economics. And then, after 20 years abroad, I came back to Norway. I came back during the pandemic, and I've been here now about 3 years. So my main research focus is Russian foreign policy, Russian political economy, integration. So a key focus being this cooperation between China and Russia in order to set up or establish a new international economic infrastructure, one that's less centered around United States, simply because in the unipolar international system the United States set up after the Cold War, the Chinese and Russians were inherently contained because of the alliance system, but also because as rising powers, they challenge the basic foundation of a unipolar system. So this was my key interest. First, how Russia was not incorporated into an inclusive Europe after the Cold War, and then I focused more on the consequences, which has been that Russia is looking east in this greater Eurasian partnership now.
Okay, that's really great and significant. As a researcher, are you allowed to be emotionally invested in what you are studying, the areas that you are researching on? For example, I have got to understand that there have been some criticism labeled against you that you sound and you seem to be pro-Russia in your commentaries, in your analysis, and in your writings, and so on and so forth.
No, well, I think that there's a huge weakness in the West, because whenever we address the security dilemma, that is how can be a threat to Russia. Russia can be a threat to us. We're missing half the analysis, because we're not effectively allowed to say that we can be a threat to Russia. So this is problematic, because as a scholar researching Russian foreign policy, how can you assess Russian security strategy if you can't address the key security threats to it. That is, if you're going to assess any country's security policy, you need to first look what's threatening the countries and then how does it respond. However, if you're not able to actually address what threatens Russia, which is primarily NATO, then you're not able to make any sense of its policies, and you get stuck into this focus only on the internal characteristics. So we only talk about what a bad man Putin is and how Russia's trying to reestablish the Soviet Union. Again, all the analysis effectively leaves us out of the analysis. And also, just briefly, I think from my perspective, I think that the weaknesses or the problem we have in Europe is the lack of a pan-European security architecture. That is, from my perspective, a Europe which isn't able to include the largest country in Europe, which is Russia, will unavoidably be divided and full of conflict. The problem is, if you repeat that here in the West, it's seen as being, sympathetic to what Russia's arguing, because that is to a large extent what Russia's arguing: its exclusion from Europe after the Cold War. And if you say this, then you can very easily be labeled, Russian agent, if you will, or being sympathetic to Russia, which is apparently a negative thing. But again, just simply put, I think if we're going to have a stable continent in Europe, we can't make an enemy out of the largest country in Europe. It's simple as that.
Oh, okay, Professor. Briefly, before we move to our main conversation point, are you pro-Russia?
Well, I'm very pro-European, and I think you can't be pro-European without being finding a way of accommodating Russia on the continent. So but pro-Russia, I would to a large extent say yes, because it's a great country, fascinating history, lovely people, great culture. So, but that's not the same as saying that I would be uncritically supportive of anything Russia does. So, for example, in this current war, the invasion of Ukraine, I've been very critical of it, because I do not think that's that was a good decision to be made.
So do you see Russia as a threat, not only to Ukraine, its immediate neighbor, but to the whole continent of Europe?
Well, yes and no. It depends on the policies we have as well. Again, in the international system, every country has to pursue build up military power in order to have its own security. Now, if we build up a lot of our military power, Russia will, of course, respond, and that would make it a threat to us. So I don't disagree with the fact that Russia can be a threat to NATO, and I also think that NATO can be a threat to Russia. Now, my main criticism is if we try to counter this threat by effectively defeating Russia on the battlefield, which appears to be our strategy, or simply surround it with NATO and make it capitulate, I don't think that will lead to any peace for us either. I think that the way to have stability and peace in Europe would be to find a common pan-European security architecture with the Russians. In other words, we can't continue this block-based system. This idea that if you only put more weapons closer and closer to Russia, somehow this will bring us stability. I think it's very flawed at its core, and it reflects some of the problem we have in the West in terms of not reforming the European security architecture after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
So do you think in this current war that is happening between Russia and Ukraine, backed by NATO alliance, do you see any way, any possibility for Ukraine and NATO to defeat Russia?
No, not really. And that's, well, again, it depends how defeat is defined, because we keep hearing that, Ukraine must win. We can't accept anything else than defeat of Russia. This is important, but no one has clearly defined defeat. If you listen to President Zelensky, he's referring to, reconquering Crimea, which the Russians annexed in 2014. Now, my problem with this is we should be careful what we wish for. If we're actually able to defeat Russia on the battlefield, we have to realize that the reason why Russia took Crimea, it was because why it took this huge step to invade Ukraine is because it considers the possibility of NATO in Ukraine to be an existential threat. This means it cannot live with it. That's why it's willing to take these huge risks. So my conclusion has simply been that we will have a nuclear holocaust long before NATO gets to march through Crimea. So I'm not sure how a victory would look like, because you can't pressure or defeat Russia on the battlefield and then threaten its existence. Most likely this will somehow lead to a nuclear exchange. So this is why I think we would all lose.
Yeah, Professor, nuclear exchange. By nuclear exchange, are you talking about the possibility of using nuclear in the process of this war?
Well, I think that the problem is this war has ended up in an all or nothing situation. In the West, we refuse to negotiate with Russia, and we seek victory. But if the victory means destruction of the Russian state, which some are now toying with that possibility, yes, I think nuclear exchange is possible. The Russian nuclear doctrine is quite clear. It will either use nuclear weapons in response, in retaliation to nuclear weapons, or second, it would use it if the existence of the states comes into, if it's threatened, if it's could be destroyed. So again, I would be careful defining victory as leading to this point.
So who is likely to use? Who is more likely to use nuclear?
Well, it all depends. It would either be the United States or Russia. Russia, if it's seen as it's being defeated and the United States would move in on Crimea, I think that could be a tipping point for the Russians. Meanwhile, on the American side, it's not really clear. I think it seems to me now that the Ukrainian army appears to be crumbling, and the Americans say they will not permit Ukraine to lose. So in a scenario, if the United States would send in some of its troops as a volunteer, under volunteer, or together with the Poles perhaps, and they would begin to be defeated on the battlefield as well, I think it would be very hard for them to lose face in this way, and they would perhaps use some tactical nuclear weapon. But again, this might seem very crazy now, Russia or United States using nuclear weapons. But this is the all or nothing conflict that we're facing.
Yeah. Okay. So I would like to draw you a little bit back to last year when the invasion of Ukraine happened, or even a little bit before the invasion. For example, I would like you to give us a kind of background to our viewers as to how this war began. For example, we knew that Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, felt he was threatened by the NATO presence, right very much closer to his country, and that's why he decided to invade Ukraine, for example. So two things, for example, here. What do our viewers have to know about this NATO that we've been talking about, the security alliance between the European countries and the Americans, for example? And then why was Putin thinking that NATO was a threat to him?
Well, it's a complex question because the conflict has two layers. It's a Ukrainian conflict, but also a NATO-Russia conflict. Now, the war began in 2014, and the background to it was NATO was pushing to expand in towards Ukraine. Now, the problem is, as NATO also acknowledged, barely 20% of Ukrainians, back in 2008 when it was promised future membership, only 20% of Ukrainians wanted membership. So it was very unpopular among the Ukrainians, but also the Russians would never accept it. Indeed, when CIA Director William Burns, he pointed out in 2008, he warned that if we would try to pull Ukraine into NATO, then it would unleash a civil war within Ukraine, and Russia would also possibly invade, even though these Russians didn't want to do it. So anyways, forwarding to 2014, this is when in the West we backed a coup in Ukraine, toppling President Yanukovych and installing an anti-Russian government. Now, this is when the problem was at two layers, because at one hand, having an anti-Russian government meant to purge the Russian language there, go after Russian minorities, the Russian church, Russian culture. So domestically, this instigated a civil war. But obviously, Russia also feared for its naval base in Crimea, so it annexed Crimea and also indirectly supported Donbas fighters who were seeking autonomy within Ukraine. So of course, Russia contributed to this fear within Ukraine. But this is why it began in 2014. And then for the next 8 years, they saw that Donbass was regularly shelled by the Ukrainian army and also supported by West. Now, the problem was gradually they saw that Ukraine, now that America was inserting itself into Ukraine. So, for example, the Americans were funding the modernization of the naval bases in Ukraine, which would be able to accommodate American warships. They were sending more of their military hardware. They trained effectively up to an army of 600,000 men in Ukraine. And this was seen to be an army used to not just defeat Donbass, but also to invade or take back Crimea by force, which would be a war with Russia. And while this conflict was happening, the Russians, they feared on two levels. One, the marginalization of the Russian speakers in the east, but also they saw NATO creeping up on Russia's border. So they saw this as again an existential threat. So it was now or not never. So at the end of 2021, the Russians demanded negotiations with NATO to get security guarantees that NATO would get out of Ukraine. They didn't get this, and in February of 2022, recognized independence of Donbass, and then claimed to come to their defense. But again, this by international law is an invasion, that's what's led us to this point.
Yeah, Putin's argument to annex Crimea in 2014 and to invade Ukraine, possibly his ultimate objective is to annex also Ukraine and make it part of Russia. The argument he has is that I want to take back something that belonged to me a long time ago, but now has broken away from me. Do you think it's okay, it's fair internationally, in terms of international politics and diplomacy, diplomatically speaking, for Putin to ask Ukraine to come back to Russia and continue being under his control, for example? Was it okay? Is it okay for him?
Well, first, I wouldn't agree with the premise because I don't think Russia's looking to annex Ukraine. Indeed, the western parts of Ukraine they're not Russian speakers. They don't associate with Russian culture, and they would under no circumstance want to be a part of Russia. Mm-hmm. I think Crimea was an easy target because it was necessary because that's where they have their naval base. Also, the vast majority of all ethnicities living on Crimea were favorable of joining Russia. And so, also because it's a peninsula, it was easy to do a clear delineation. The problem of going into Donbass is, the further west they march, the fewer people want them there. So I don't think they would want to annex all of Ukraine. And also, I don't think that I think the motivations of Russia that they largely reacted to, they responded to the threat of NATO expansion. So again, if there hadn't been a coup, if NATO hadn't tried to roll into Ukraine, which they were doing, Russia wouldn't have invaded. That being said, I tend to favor the principles of territorial integrity and non-use of force in international affairs, which is why under international law, this invasion was illegal. So this is again why I've been opposed to the war, and I think it was wrong. So I don't. I'm not too happy about it, and also for the Ukrainians who are now concerned they will lose large amount of their economy and their territory as a result of the Russian invasion. I can have all sympathy in the world for this. It's of course.
And at the same time, NATO's expansion towards Ukraine was also an act of provocation, for example, and it would have been, or it would be seen as something illegal, right? As an illegal move.
The coup was seen as being illegal. There's no rules against in international law to expand a military alliance. Again, this is by international law. If but of course, in 2014 they had a government who made neutrality part of the law in Ukraine, and again, only 20% of the population wanted to be a part of NATO. So then it wasn't really a problem. But after the coup, then of course they have a pro-American, anti-Russian government in place. Now NATO expansion is on the table, but it's not against international law to wanting to join a military alliance. But that being said, it's also known in great power politics that that great powers will simply won't accept it. Imagine if China or Russia, for example, brought in Mexico in a military alliance, and you would see Chinese military weapon systems, warships starting to appear in Mexico. Under no circumstance would the United States accept this. They would effectively bomb the whole country to the ground to prevent this. And again, we see the same in the Solomon Islands. The Chinese have even discussed some security cooperation there, and the Americans immediately say this is a threat to international stability. So you have international law, and then you have the reality also of how great powers will act. And there's no chance at all that Russia would ever accept to have American bases or warships in, for example, on the coast in Ukraine. Again, that doesn't mean that it's international law, of course.
And maybe that is why some people are critical of the of that theory of international relations, the theory of realism, which describes the international politics as anarchic in nature. For example, the big powers can do whatever they want without kind of, the consideration of the poor people or the people that are as the receiving end, for example. Am I right to say that this theory of realism is just indicating and vindicating the flows of the international system that we're practicing right now?
Well, the international anarchy simply refers to the absence of a world government. So every state have to fend for itself. Now, this is the point of departure both in liberal theory and realist theory. Liberal theory thinks you can overcome the anarchy if you just, have democracy, international institutions, international law. Realist theory assumes you need a balance of power. Now, often realist theory is portrayed as being immoral, but it's actually amoral. That means it doesn't address morality. So, for example, it's not that the realists say, "Oh, wonderful, Russia has the right to invade Ukraine." They're mainly pointing out that this is how the world works. In other words, if you're concerned about the security of Mexico or the security of or Ukraine, don't put Chinese military bases in Mexico, and don't put American military bases in Ukraine, because they will be annihilated. But actually, what you see many realists, they were, for these kind of reasons, they were very much opposed to the idea of invading Vietnam, to invade Iraq. They've been very critical of the proxy war in Ukraine. While often actually you see liberal scholars being more idealistic. They think, if we can go into Ukraine or Iraq or Vietnam and convert it into democracy, and then we'll have perpetual peace. So often you see that the realists are more apprehensive about these wars than those subscribing to liberal theory. So that's can be seen as a bit of a contradiction.
Yes, of course. So fast forward, we are kind of drawing to the end, towards the end of this episode. Fast forward to, is it 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago? We had China trying to mediate. It was last week, of course, that French President Emmanuel Macron and the leader of the European Union Commission went to China. And in fact, they even met the Chinese President Xi Jinping, trying to resolve the conflict in Ukraine, for example. Now, in summary, how could you evaluate the China's roles, for example, in bringing an end to this Russia-Ukrainian war?
Well, the benefit of China is it's not part of any alliances. It doesn't use an alliance system to advance its interests, simply because it's pushing for a multipolar system, and because of its economic interests. Any alliance system would alienate one part while making the other dependent. So China doesn't actually follow this model. Instead, we see that China has an economic interest in having close partnership with Russia, but they also have a economic interest in having a close partnership with Ukraine, because they poured trillions of dollars into this Belt and Road Initiative, these land corridors and sea corridors. A lot of these would go through Ukraine. So having a war between Russia and Ukraine is not in the Chinese interest. So same as having a conflict between the Europeans and the Russians is not in the Chinese interest. Maybe to some extent to take some of the Western military threats, away from China and directed towards Russia. But beyond this, the economic interest of China simply stipulates it would like to have peace in that region. So I think one should take the Chinese proposal quite serious.
So, Professor, it seems like given your explanation and your analysis, that we should not give China a round of applause for trying to bring an end to this war, because as some Indians are insinuating, China is not doing this for the benefit of the ordinary people and on the ground in Ukraine that are suffering. It's just doing it for its own economic, quote unquote, economic gains and benefits. How do you see it?
Well, I think that would be correct and incorrect at the same time, because I've made the point. I don't think China inherently because it has some interest that always coincides with the best interests of the world and all of humanity. They're a great power on interests, but I think that we can always trust that the Chinese will act in their own interest. And it's exactly because it is in China's own interest to have peace in Europe. They do not want a conflict between Russia and Ukraine or Russia and NATO. This destabilizes or undermines China's economic interests. So again, I think we can trust that the Chinese will act in their own interest, and they do want peace. So as long as that's in our interest, I think that pragmatism is so far the best opportunity we have.
What makes China become the only country to persuade Putin, for example, if it happens, for example, let's assume that China successfully succeeds in persuading Putin to stop the war, for example, and the Chinese successfully resolve the conflict. What do you think would make China do that successfully? What kind of leverage do the Chinese have, for example?
Well, they have a lot of economic leverage in terms of the relationship with Russia. China is the most important partner of Russia. But that being said, the Chinese would not force the Russians to capitulate, because the Russians are the most important partner of the Chinese as well. So in other words, when we saw that, for example, President Macron went to China he said he was going to push or pressure Xi Jinping to put pressure on Putin. Well, to do what? In the NATO countries, we have rejected any negotiations, any ceasefire. So exactly how's China going to pressure Russia to sit down and negotiate when Russia already said it's willing to negotiate? So the problem is often when we say negotiate, we mean capitulate, pressure Russia to withdraw from Ukraine. But that effectively puts Russia in the situation that if they go out of Ukraine, NATO will follow them into Ukraine. And this is the existential threat of Russia. So for this, I don't think we can rely on China at all. The Chinese are not going to help us to make Russia capitulate. I think if we're willing to find a peace with Russia, address its security issues such as NATO expansion, I think that in such a situation, the Chinese will be more prepared to lean a bit on Russia, either offering most likely economic incentives rather than threatening Russia, because these threats of sanctions, it's simply not going to happen.
So you're saying that the Chinese should do more by also talking to the NATO and convincing them to stop their expansion, what do you call it, expansionism, of course.
Well, I'm saying that I think China would assist in facilitating a peace agreement, but so far in the West, we said we're not interested in negotiating peace. We want capitulation. We want Russia to simply withdraw and be defeated. Now, for this, China will not help us. They will not help us defeat Russia. They will help to find a negotiated settlement. But as long as we're not willing to sit down and talk with Russia, then it's very limited what the Chinese are expected to do here. They're not going to make Russia surrender and simply pull out and see NATO establish themselves on their borders.
So in 2 minutes, we are ending this. One thing, you guys are selfish, yes or no?
You guys being?
The Europeans.
I think we pursued a hegemonic approach to security. This was very clearly stipulated after the Cold War. That is, the security in the world will depend on the global primacy of the United States in perpetuity, and Europe would be its junior partner. It was assumed that this would be a Pax Romana, something that would bring stability to the whole world, a benign hegemon, if you will. I think that kind of failed, and our unwillingness to adapt to the reality of a multipolar world emerging, I think, yeah, that aspect is not just selfish, it's quite foolish because it doesn't serve our interest either.
So how does it affect your country, Norway, the whole thing, the whole war, the invasion? How does it affect Norway?
Well, first, we all live under the threat of possibly being consumed in a nuclear holocaust, which is, well, obviously not pleasant, but also in the economic sphere, it's quite problematic because with now that we're in conflict with Russia, the United States has a lot of economic influence over us because we're dependent on the US for security. And as our dependency on the US increases, US is able to assert bloc discipline and get economic loyalty from us. Again, this has been a problem for the US for years now. We're trying to make Europeans stop buying Russian energy, stop buying Chinese technologies. Now that we're very dependent on the United States in this situation of a war, the Americans can extract anything from us effectively, which is now we cut ourselves off Russian energy, which means that energy-intensive industries in Germany are collapsing and their economies are faltering. And also now the Americans are pressuring Europe to cut its some economic ties with China. And this would make us completely dependent on the US, giving us vassal status at least. And this is very problematic. This is also why the EU is now saying perhaps we have to push a little bit back in order to have some sovereign autonomy.
And in fact, some of the biggest economies in Europe are facing a lot of economic turmoils. Take a look at the UK, for example, France, there are protests. Many other countries in Europe are feeling the brunt. And let's hope this war will come to an end so as to solve kind of most of these problems that are bedeviling not only your continent, but also our continent, Africa, that is also feeling the brunt of the war, especially economically speaking. Professor, thank you very much for participating on this episode in which we've talked about the Ukraine war and the roles of China. In fact, it's even talked about a wide range of other issues that are related and connected either directly or indirectly to this war. What can you say about this interview? Have you enjoyed it?
Yeah, very pleasant. Thank you. And I also agree with your sentiment. I think getting an end to this war should be the number one priority, if not only for humanitarian interests, for all the suffering that's currently happening in Ukraine, but also to stabilize the economies in the West and Russia, but also, and as well, taking the prospect of nuclear war off the table.
All right. So thank you once again, Professor. Professor Glenn Diesen from the University of Southeastern Norway for talking to me on this episode. On behalf of everyone that has contributed to this episode, my name is Umar Isa Dandago saying see you soon in the next episode in which we'll talk about the Iran-Saudi Arabia diplomatic dispute.